Hey Sugar Snaps, welcome back to the studio. If you're new here, my name is Brittany. Textile Indie is a channel about fiber arts and basket weaving. Today I'm going to share a tutorial on how to make wool felt balls and how to use those balls to create a holiday wreath. I immersion dyed this Coriadale fiber. If you want to dye your own fiber, you can check out this video. I did a multicolor immersion dye. These are single color immersion dye. Do the same process as the video, but you just use one color instead of multiple. So I did teal jacquard acid dye on this wool and vermilion jacquard acid dye on this guy to make this deep burgundy. The materials and tools you'll need are obviously some wool. You'll want a small piece of bubble wrap. I have a piece about 12 by 12 inches. A bar of soap. I'm using olive oil bar soap, and you can find links to all of these tools and materials in this description below. A large bath towel and a hand towel, a water tub with warm water, and you'll also want a plastic Tupperware with a lid that when it's closed, you can have water in it and the water won't slosh out. So what is that, watertight? Watertight container. The reason we're using a watertight container is that doing wool balls one at a time and getting them to the density that you want can take a long time. And because I want lots of wool balls for my wreath, I want to speed that process up a bit. So I'm going to get them started by hand, and then once they're firm enough to hold themselves together, then I'll put them into my container and slosh that around with a little bit of water and soap, and that will continue to felt them all at the same time, so I can get multiple felted balls going together. To set up your work surface, clear your space, and you can do this by a sink so that's a little bit neater and not quite as soapy and messy in your workspace. I'm going to do this right here. So I'll lay out my towel in front of me, and this hand towel can either be to wipe your hands off as needed, or you can put it under your water bin, however you want to set that up. I'll use it for my hands as needed. Your bar of soap and bubble wrap, these can set on top of your work surface. Now the bubble wrap, you want the bubble side face up. That's going to be the texture. We're going to use that texture to felt the balls. And then have your container nearby, open and ready to go, and then your wool. The size of your wool ball will depend on a number of factors, one of which is how much wool you actually use, and another is how dense you end up felting it. So to get a piece of wool off of your bunch, and I'm using roving, you can use bats or a raw wool that you washed if you want to use that instead. You'll kind of pull on the end, and I'm firmly grasping the end and loosely grasping where it's coming out of the length of the roving until I pull off a piece. So again, loosely gripping with this hand, tightly gripping with this hand to pull the fibers apart and getting bunches of the wool to come out. And if you space your hands pretty evenly as you're working, or as you're pulling these lengths out, you'll end up with about the same length. If you want to be very particular about how much wool you're using, you can get a small kitchen scale and kind of weigh the fiber out on the scale to get the same amount of wool per ball, and that will help to probably get a similar size. I'm just going to kind of pull this apart into pieces and then take these pieces and break them into smaller pieces or in half to get enough fiber for multiple wool balls. I'm not ending up with exactly the same amount of fiber here, and so I'll end up with different sizes to play around with. So I'll lay these out in front of me, and these are all going to become little wool pieces to use in my wreath. And I'm doing this all with dry hands. Once you get your hands wet, it's pretty challenging to get the wool to do what you want until the wool is also wet. So I'm breaking these pieces up, and then we'll start to do the felting once I have all my pieces laid out here. And I'm just kind of gently layering them on top of each other. And now I'll pull out from the teal. I'm gonna do the same thing like so. This wreath, I'm kind of playing it by ear. So I'm going to go for about 40 wool balls and play around with that. I may need to make some more to fill in space or just make it the size it ends up. If you have an exact image in mind or you want it to be an exact size, maybe gauge for that to sketch it out a bit, or watch to the end of the video and see what happens. We'll see how this thing turns out. Okay, I'll lay these guys over here. I'm not feeling very precise today, so I'm kind of just winging it. See what happens. I've got probably about 20 there now. I have about 20 piles of the vermilion and 20 piles of the teal. So I'm gonna dive in here. Just start with one of your pieces. And this little tub will go right here. Once the balls get to the density I need, we'll dump them in there and we'll go from there. So first of all, take your wool, and I have this strip, so I'm working with roving. If you're working with something else, it may be a little bit different. But with this strip of fiber, I'm gonna take these ends and kind of fold them in towards the center on both sides. And I'm doing this both directions, rolling it up until I get to the end. And when I get to this end point, I'm going to take these, fluff them out, and curve them over the ends and around the shape to kind of create a little package, little puff ball. So if it looks like a cotton ball, you're doing it right, like so. And now the fibers are kind of holding it together. It can move around a bit and still maintain its shape. And it's really cute like that. We could just do a wreath with all little puff balls if we wanted to. But we're gonna felt these because why not? So with this guy, take your bin of water, and I'm going to hold it in my hand like this so that the shape kind of maintains and doesn't wash away. And take it in this claw shape and dump it in your water. And you may have to dunk it for a few seconds to get the wool to soak up the water. And you can see I lost my poofy shape and it's kind of globby now. So if there are any fibers sticking up, gently wrap those around to get them absorbed into the shape of the ball. And if it's not quite wet enough, it's not wet all the way through, you can get it wet again. Now we need to set up our bubble wrap and get some soap going on. So bring a little handful of water, sprinkle it onto your bubble wrap, and then rub the soap over your bubble wrap to work up a suds, work up bubbles on your work surface. And now you can do the same thing on your hands. Get some soap in your hands. We'll start out forming this by rolling it gently, and I'm just kind of setting it in my hand and working it gently between my hands. And then once it's formed a round shape, you'll just continue to roll it like this for several minutes. And if you end up with these little pockets, divots, where the wool has kind of pulled away or created a crease, you can pull those out and kind of work them out. If they're still there as we do the felting, we'll cover them with another piece of wool that will help to remove any divots or creases or folds. So like this has a lot of folds there, we'll fix that here in a few minutes. So dump that in your water again, start rolling it around on your bubble wrap in the soap, get lots of soap on there. One reason to use olive oil soap, which is this bar soap I'm using, is that it's a little bit more gentle on the wool, and it doesn't strip it of all the natural oils that the wool needs to stay high in quality. If you use a really heavy detergent or something that's not necessarily meant for wool, you run the risk of ruining the wool. And for wool balls, that's not as big of a deal as when you are trying to do something like a garment piece that you will want to wash more regularly. Once we create this wreath, we're probably not going to be getting it wet or need to wash it again. So I'm alternating between rubbing it on the bubble wrap surface and rubbing it between my hands. And now I'm adding a little bit of more pressure, really pressing on that wool ball. You can rinse it off to check to see the shape. And I have a little crease here, like the butt of a peach. And I'm going to take a little piece of wool and cover that with another little piece of wool, wrap it around to cover that crease so that doesn't end up in my finished piece. And now you can roll that bit of wool onto your ball or bead. These can also be used as beads. Roll that on there, and now felt that on there as well. And it really doesn't take much to get that to attach and felt right on top of the previous surface. And it also does a really good job of covering up that crease that we ended up with. So alternate between the bubble wrap and your hands and dip it into the bin of water every once in a while. If you want to have a cold bin of water beside you as well, you can alternate into that also. The change between water temperature and the friction of your hands and the soap and the bubble wrap really start to tangle the fibers together. Felt is just wool fibers tangled tightly together, and the little burrs on the hairs of the wool rub together and get tighter and tighter together until the wool structure is so tangled up that you can't pull it apart. So once you have created felt, you can't uncreate it because the burrs are so tightly attached together. So if you've ever felted your wool sweater and tried to come up with a good way to unfelt it, I'm sorry to say there isn't one. And there is my first wool ball. I did this entirely by hand. I went ahead and did the whole thing by hand. If you want to do that, you can. So it still has a bit of squish to it, but it's a nice density for my wreath. And we'll set this aside. When we're all done with all of our wool beads or balls, we will soak these in vinegar to remove all the excess soap so that the interior of the ball doesn't mildew. Grab another piece of your wool and do the same thing, rolling it up from one end, fluffing the ends over your little bundle, gripping it with your hand and getting it wet in your water bin until it's nice and damp. And now gently rolling it in your hand and then in the soap. Get it nice and soapy. Now I'll show you how to do multiples at the same time. So we'll get this to a point where it's holding its shape. Like right about here. And when you drop it, it will still splat, kind of flatten on your work surface, but it's holding its shape enough that tossed around in the bin, it won't totally come undone. And you may end up with creases on these ones as well. You can fluff over more of the fiber to cover that, or later on we'll add a little bit more. So drop that into your bin and do several more to fill the bin with. You probably want about 5 to 10 in there to get them going. If your hands start to feel pruny and gross, you can always take a break. You can do this with rubber gloves, I suppose. I've never actually tried, but I think that that would make it harder to feel the wool, and my rubber gloves are too big, so I can't really grip things and get into the details of the fibers like I can if I'm not wearing gloves. I prefer doing this and just taking breaks. And once your bead is wet, or your ball is wet, you can also rub it right onto the soap to get it nice and soapy, and that will get enough soap in there that it's a little bit easier to felt as well. The bubble wrap is good assistance, but you can do this whole process without it and just use your hands. The rolling around in your hands does a great job of getting the felt going. Most wet felting projects, you really need lots of water and space, and you kind of want to do it in the kitchen or near the bathtub or somewhere that you can get wet and messy. It's a great summer project because you can be outside when it's warmer, and especially if you're using biodegradable soap, if you can do it in the garden or on a back porch or something like that. However, wet felting beads doesn't take that much space, and you can even do this sitting on your couch next to a coffee table if you just have a little bit of water to work with and some soap. You can work with the tub on your lap, maybe a towel, or have it sitting on a coffee table. When you're constantly doing projects, you find ways to make it work. Okay, this guy really doesn't want to fold up, so I'm gonna get another little tuft of wool here. Ooh, that might be too big. Oh well. Wrap this around. Create another layer to seam that closed a bit. Okay, let's see how this container situation works out for us. So get your last bead in there. I dry off my hands. This is also nice because it gives your hands a bit of a dry out break. Dump this into your water, get a bit of water in there, and then slosh your soap around a bit so you get some good soap suds going on in there, like so. Now tightly close the lid over top. And with the lid tightly closed, I'm going to rotate this around in a circle, and the wool balls, what they're doing in there is kind of hitting all of the walls and rubbing up against each other. And this is not as watertight as I want it to be, but that's okay. So rolling it around in a circle, kind of beating them up in there, and then you can tap it up and down and around in a circle again and up and down. And every once in a while, check it to make sure that you have enough water for these to roll around in. They do like to soak up the water, so I'm gonna add water in there, and there's enough soap, so I'll just hopefully your container is more watertight than mine is. Mine isn't working very well, which is why you have lots of towels down. Okay. Now you can check your wool balls and see how they're forming. The shape's coming out pretty good. These are all ending up fairly round. The density is still pretty smushy. So I'm gonna keep going. Spin in one direction and then spin in the other direction. If your arm gets tired, switch arms. This is like wax on, wax off. Whoa, my left hand is way weaker than my right hand. I'm really having to think about this. Okay, open this up. Ooh, nice. Rinse some of these out. Okay, these are still pretty soft, but I think the shape is really nice. They formed nice and round, or mostly round. They don't have any creases in them. They, like I said, the density is still a little bit soft, but because I'm making a wreath out of these, they don't really need to be any specific density. I want them to hold together nicely. So kind of roll them into a round shape if they're not already. A little bit of extra rolling will also tighten them up a bit. If you're doing beads with this wool ball technique, you want them to not be super dense, to have some squish to them so that you can poke a needle through and pull whatever you're threading them onto through. If they're really dense, it's very difficult to pull a needle through, needle and thread or needle and twine or whatever through. So having it be a little bit squishier like this, where it squishes in your hands, will make that a lot easier. Okay, so I've got a nice little handful of wool balls. So cute, varying sizes. So that worked out pretty well. I'm gonna rinse these last two out. And you squish out the excess water for right now. Okay, so I'm gonna do that another round here, do another set, do some teal. And I'll try seeing if I just do a really small amount of rolling, just a few rolls, and throw those in if that works, or if you need to have it be pretty formed already. I think that if they're so soft still that they don't hold together enough, that they'll just end up flat or flopping around and not really form a bead shape or a round shape. But it's good to test things out, so we'll see what happens. Fiber arts can be very repetitive. We're doing the same process over and over again here. And that can be sometimes tedious if you're in a hurry, but it's also a nice way to connect your hands with your brain and do something with your hands and do something creative, but without having to totally 100% focus on it, because you can kind of let your mind drift or think about other things. Think about your wreath design, how you want it to look. And it even allows time to just be and not have to worry about anything. Because your hands are working, you can have your mind engaged. But if you want to wander and just sit in the moment and be with the project, and maybe with the people that you're with, Fiber Arts is a great opportunity to do that, because you can get the muscle memory in place and then do while you're being. Well, ball making is a great activity with a group of people too, because you can talk and do this at the same time. I taught wool bead making, the same process, for Art in the Park this summer, and I had a 3-year-old make a wool bead. So this is fairly accessible, and even if you end up with a funky shaped bead or a bead that has a crease in it, or, well, we're making wool balls, but same process. You're still creating something, and that's pretty exciting. I strung the 3-year-old's bead on a piece of twine, tied it around his neck, and he had the biggest grin on his face. He was super excited. There's just something about creating something with your hands that is very satisfying. Okay, I'm gonna do one more here and then close up the bin and shake them in the bin. So I've done a lot less rolling with this set, and we'll see how that turns out. It may mess up these wool balls, we'll see. Okay, nice and pruny. I'm gonna dip this into the water again, get a good amount in there, and then slosh around my, oop, that's slippery, slosh around my soap bar. Get some good soap suds in there. If you find that your container is not as watertight as you thought it was, like mine, you can always put a towel over top of it to kind of catch the splashes and then start this sloshing around. And these guys, we lay them out. You can kind of start to see what a wreath shape would look like if we layer them. And I'm thinking my wreath's probably going to be about 8 inches in diameter. So not a huge one, but something that's still substantial enough that it's visible. You could do a small wreath where you're doing just one bead kind of around like this, and then tie a ribbon bow and put the ribbon bow down below it. And if I were to do this, I'd probably string them on wires so I could shape the strand. I'm not actually sure how I'm going to string my wreath yet. Let's see how that's working out. Oh, nice. Okay, so they're fluffy. They've kind of balled up because there's enough water and soap to puff them up. Add a little bit of water. Close this back up. Keep going. I'm using vermilion and teal, but you can use whatever colors you want. You can use multicolor wool or dye your wool yourself. You can order wool pre-dyed. I have links to Paradise Fibers in the description below. They're a wool and fiber company that I really enjoy and get a lot of my fibers from. I actually bought this fiber white from them and then dyed it myself. But they have lots of options and lots of great colors as well if you don't want to do your own dyeing. I'm gonna check this guy. Okay, rinse these out and see how they're looking. Ooh, still pretty soft and they're kind of fluffy. They're a lot fluffier than the other ones, which, I mean, they have little hair, lots of little hairs coming off of them. That might be because we didn't, or I didn't roll them quite as much before sticking them in here. I'm gonna go a few more minutes and then pull them out. Okay, these look pretty good. Some of them are a little funky shapes, so I'll just roll them around to make them more rounded. Like that. Yay, that worked. So a little bit less rolling works as well. So you can play around with how much you prep them before sticking them into the bin. I'm going to go ahead and keep making wool balls here, and then we'll start making our wreath. All my wool balls are felted and I have them in a bowl of lukewarm water, and I added half a cup of white distilled vinegar to this bowl, and they've been resting in here for about 15 minutes. The white vinegar helps to draw out all of the soap suds and kind of neutralize the soap suds in the wool. So now I'll pull these out and I'm going to squeeze out a handful at a time and lay them out on the towel. And I may have to add the round shape back in by rolling them in my hand to re-establish that round shape, because some of these are pretty soft and so they got flattened. I could wait and let these dry, and that would probably be a good idea, but I figure they're gonna dry on the wreath anyways. I might as well make the wreath and let them dry once I hang it up, rather than letting these sit here for another day or two and waiting for them to dry and then making a wreath. I'll just dive in instead. So I have all of these wool balls, and to be honest, I didn't really think about how I was going to make the wreath, but my brain kind of kicked in as I was making the wool balls. The nice thing about repetitive tasks is that you have time to think and come up with ideas. So what I think I'm going to do is use wire thread the wool balls on wire. And I tried just poking the wire into the wool ball, and it doesn't really work because the wire catches on the fibers and just kind of pushes them in. Didn't work very well. So I got this large eye tapestry needle, threaded the wire onto the needle, and then folded this over. And you can use a little pair of pliers to crimp this on so that it's as flush with the needle as possible, like so. And this, we'll see if this works on camera. This pulls the wire through. Okay, well, it worked the first time. Oh, there we go. You just have to pull on it. So that will thread my wool balls, and then I can use the wire to kind of shape. It'll give it a little bit more sturdiness. And if I need more, I can always wrap additional wire around it to extend that out. So that's how I'm going to string them. Now I need to decide what my pattern is going to be, or my shape, because I could just do a strand of wool balls that look like this, just kind of randomly string them together and just do one row. But I kind of want to play around with what it would look like to have multiple layers. So something like this, a 2-layer piece, which, now that I look at this, is really just 2 circles butted up against each other. So maybe I do 2 circles and then wire them together. Let's see if I like this when it's all complete. Okay, that's pretty cute. I like that. I think I need to change out some of these here, maybe for like that. Use this one here. Balance out the sizes a little bit. So I'll take these center pieces, all of these wool balls in the center, and I'm going to work around in the circle like this, threading all of these pieces. And I'm just pushing the needle through the middle and kind of grabbing it at the base where the wire is, and then threading it on. To get them on initially. And with this big needle, it makes it a lot easier to pull the wire on or through the beads. Okay, and then take the needle off. And these guys, on this first strand, I'm going to finish this off, cut my wire down with wire cutters, and then twist this around so that I make my first circle of wool balls. Twist this up and crisscross in opposite directions so that they're hooked together there, and you can squish your wool balls away to do this. And then crimp these down so that they're folded over themselves. And this is floral wire, 22 gauge floral wire, so it's green. Now I'll wrap this around like so, just a few times, and then cut it down, so leave a little bit of a tail, and kind of squish the wool ball over top of it to hide that. And then I'll do the same thing on the other side, wrapping this around, and I'll grip this guy with my wire or my pliers. My hands are still kind of wet because the wool balls are wet, so I'm slipping on the wires here. Okay, I'll just do one wrap for this guy and then cut this down to a little tail. Okay, here's my first ring. I'm gonna smush those wires together, the wool balls together. There's my first section of the wreath. I'll go in with a new piece of wire. So I'll cut a piece. I have about 2 feet here. I thread my needle on. Crimp the needle on so that this is as tight as possible. Otherwise it makes it harder to fit through the wool balls. Okay, so that's on. And now this end, I'm going to come in between two of these wool balls and loop it around nice and tight, as tight as I can, so I have a good starting point, like so. Okay, so that's looped around. Now I'll cut this end like so, and thread on a wool ball, pull it through, and tuck it down right in between two of these previous ones. So it's tucked right like that, and then bring the wire down in between so that it comes on top of the wire, and then I'll thread it through the wreath to the back so that it wraps around. Push the wool balls together like that. And now take another wool ball. I may need to see my pattern again. I'm kind of doing random a little bit. Okay, so I'll do this guy next, like so, and then loop this over. So I came up in between these two. Now I'm going to come up and press this down in between these two, stick my needle through, pull the wire through to the back so that they're right up next to each other like that. Now I'll do the next one, pull it through and right up, and I want it between these two here, so I'll dip this down, and I'm creating a little shelf, so this little section of the wire for the new bead to sit on, and then pressing it down in between the layers, threading it through with my needle, just through the space, not through anything specifically, and then pulling it up, so I'm creating a little cinch right here, and the balls press against each other to hide the wire. Okay, I'm back to the beginning. I'm gonna wrap the wire around again to finish it off so that it tucks inside between the wool balls. And because the wool balls are a little bit softer, I didn't do them super firm. They're able to kind of squish and mold and fill that space. And you could do a bow with matching ribbon. I'm gonna use the black because it's what I have. Tie a little bow, and then you could attach that somewhere on the wreath as well. This turned out pretty cute. You can glue the wool balls together using hot glue. I chose not to do that because hot glue on wool felt doesn't really come off if you want to use the wool balls for something else or take it apart or add to it or something like that. So feel free to use hot glue if you're not worried about it, but also know that the wire works pretty well too. Thanks so much for joining me in making wool felt balls or beads and putting together a wreath. You can do these with any colors, obviously, and play around with the different times of year. This would be a fun spring wreath done in brighter colors, or a summer wreath. It's great for winter because it's cozy and fuzzy. So lots of different applications. Have fun with it. You can use wool balls to do garlands as well, string them and use them as garlands or as ornaments if you want to put one or two together. There's just a lot of ways you can use wool balls to decorate with, so lots of fun possibilities. I hope you get a chance to try making wool balls yourself and creating some sort of ornament or decoration. If you do, I'd love to see it. You can tag me on Instagram at TextileIndie or use the hashtag TextileIndie. If you're new here, I'd love you to subscribe, hit the subscribe below and the thumbs up so that this video gets spread to others that enjoy making things. If you've been here for a while, thanks so much for supporting the channel throughout the last, well, however long I've been doing this, and I look forward to another year of creating and making together. Until next time, happy making. See you later.